Nachman entirely new. And lives are changed and existence changes and inventions come to the world because these new neshamas, whole new things come into the world. And particularly, I mean, the good news especially is that even when the material situation remains the same, the newness that comes into our mood and our feelings and our perceptions and our self-understanding, that is something entirely new. We are not bound by the past. Of course we're bound in some ways by the past, but we're not slaves to things that we can never ever get out of this prison because that's what happened in the past. That is the whole chiddush of the Torah, that there is teva, which is rules and a limited energy system, and that is nes, and this is a completely different energy. And I think it's clear to anybody who makes a serious study of contemporary physics that that's the way that scientists are beginning to see that the world has to be that way. The world actually is that way. I mean, they keep on discovering new things, new, newness. Yes.
In Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Nachman is so popular, and his his teachings are so well learned. Why is there such a lag between what's going on in the rest of the world? Let's talk about America, and between Eretz Yisrael. Why is there such a gap between the two things?
I moved from Britain to Eretz Yisrael to live when I was 29. That's going back 30 years ago, and I was in culture shock when I got to Israel, because things, situations, and people were just tougher in Israel than they are in Britain or America. Maybe it's different, I don't know, in Bangladesh or some other place, but things are just different. People behave differently. I mean, obviously there's unpleasant situations in Britain or America, but there's some politeness and a certain way of doing things that is not a jungle way of doing things. And it's very hard for people to come from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael to come face to face with this. I mean, the Bolsheviks got to Israel very early on and seemed to lay down the tone of the government ministries and of the bureaucracy and so on and so forth. And added to that, the Gemara in Tainis, it says, Eretz Yisrael shoysa b'chila, v'kol ha'olam achareh. Israel drinks first. By the rains, Israel drinks, and the whole rest of the world gets what it gets. Well, in September the 12th of 2001, I quoted that Gemara in a piece I wrote, commenting on what had happened, that there was a terrible catastrophe that befell New York City. But Israel had already drunk that bit of water long before, with terrorist outrage after terrorist outrage. It was, admittedly, the scale of what happened on 9/11 was vastly greater than but there have been Israel has been has been so accustomed to such terrible things, and the terrible nightmare years of the late 90s, and in 2000 particularly, with the beginning of the Second Intifada, that the Israelis have been living with this situation for much longer. I think that there's undoubtedly something to do with just the very nature of Eretz Yisrael. I mean, Rav Kook once spoke to a man who came to him and was taking his leave because after trying to live in Eretz Yisrael for many years, he just felt he couldn't. He had to go back to America. And Rav Kook said to him, I see, well, where are you going to? And the man said, he's going to live in Arizona. So Rav Kook said, Arizona? There's so many sick people there. So many people with respiratory illnesses in Arizona. How can you go to Arizona? So the man says to him, Rabbi, don't you understand the reason why all these people with respiratory illness go to Arizona is because the climate is so conducive to their healing. Says Rav Kook, well, that's the same with Eretz Yisrael. that all these people with all these divisions, all this machlokes, is all in Eretz Yisrael because the land is actually conducive to the healing of it. Reb Nachman saw it as one of the greatest achievements of his life, that he succeeded in stepping foot in Eretz Yisrael. He saw it indeed as a tikkun for Moshe Rabbeinu, that the soul of Moshe that was in him reached Eretz Yisrael and opened the way for the great aliyahs that took place afterwards, the followers of the Gru and the followers of the Baal Shem Tov, and later on the whole Zionist enterprise. It all came after that. And I think that the atmosphere in Eretz Yisrael simply softened up all of our hearts. I mean, over these years. I remember when I first went to Eretz Yisrael, my very first visit was in 1970. I was not from, it was 3 years after the Six-Day War. And you could walk anywhere in Yerushalayim. I mean, I walked alone through the up and down, through the entire Arab shuk, that disgusting, dung, stinking area, without any kind of fear. And I remember 20 years later, in 1987, a friend of mine suggested that to go out for Rosh Hashanah to Meron, we couldn't yet go to Uman, that we should drive up to Meron from Yerushalayim in a rented car via Shechem to visit on Erev Rosh Hashanah the grave of Yosef HaTzadik. So we drove up. For those of you to orient you historically, it was in the fall of 1987 that the Intifada actually began. So this was just before, in September, because it started in October. And we were driving up to Shechem, and we get lost in the Arab Kfarim. And we're totally lost, have no idea how to get to Shechem. And we didn't worry at all, we were not worried, there was no fear. I mean, today, the very thought that you'd be lost in that area, you'd be dead, you know. So, you know, we stopped the car and asked, perhaps the fact that we were speaking English made it a little different, I don't know, but some Arabs from the village told us how to get back to the highway and into Shechem. We got to Yosef HaTzadik, we got back to Meron, and that is now completely unthinkable to do such a thing. They won't let you near the kever of Yosef HaTzadik. That's part of the...
Well, now they have a monthly trip, you know, or...
They do, I know, but in those days...
It's guarded with a bit, yeah.
Army goods. So now, first the Intifada started in 87. They started by throwing stones, and next it developed to stabbings on the Damascus Gate, and then I remember reading a BBC correspondent in 1994, after Oslo, when it was just beginning, writing that the West Bank has become awash with arms. Somebody was just bringing in the arms, and they turned that from being Eretz Yisrael to being a jungle, mamish, a jungle and a hell and worse. And how many of our people, how much of our blood has been spilled? I mean, well, that softened up all of our hearts. You know, Saddam Hussein's scuds in 1991, and everything that's been going on. I mean, the terrible years from 2000, 2001, 2000, the Netanya Hotel bombing, and every day King George Street, the pizza bombing, and the Hilo bombing. I mean, that's why people turn to Rav Nachman, because the only hope there is the spiritual hope. What possible hope is there in a secular Zionism? What possible hope is there in having gay pride marches in Yerushalayim and having you know what happened in 1987? Coincidental with the beginning of the Intifada, that was exactly the time when Teddy Klotzek, the then mayor of Jerusalem, for those who haven't caught my British humor, I'll just bring out again the cloth. He changed the Jerusalem municipal regulations and permitted the opening of places of entertainment and restaurants on Shabbos. That was the first major breach of the status quo of commerce in Yerushalayim on the Shabbos. It was exactly then that the Arabs started throwing stones. You're breaking Shabbos? Stones!